Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Dr. Brian Harman. Brian is a leadership professor and professional speaker who uses his humorous approach to engage and motivate leaders. He speaks at Fortune 500 companies, TEDx events, and universities all around the world. He writes for Forbes and teaches leadership at UCLA, UC Berkeley, and the ESAN Graduate School of Business in Peru. Brian might also be the only grown man alive who can say the word love over and over again without being massively embarrassed. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Harman. Brian, welcome to the show.
Yeah, Francisco, thanks for the introduction. Good to be here, and it's good to see you.
You too, man. And this is not the only thing you do, saying the word love and actually basing a lot of your approach with leadership on love that I thought was potentially mentally deranged. I heard you say this thing the other day, and I wanted to check that this is actually true, because to me, this didn't seem real. Do you actually ask your wife what annoys you about me?
Oh, shit. Yeah. So this is a question that, yes, I do ask her on maybe an annual basis. I want to make sure that the people around me have an opening to give me candid feedback. Without the radical candor and that critique, people often will keep those pieces of information that are highly valuable to you so you can make improvements and growth to themselves. So I want to give them that opening. I want to constantly ask for feedback. So that's where that came from. And yes, I do like to say the word love, lead with love. And what that means to me is that I live a life according to my core values, love being the first one.
I like how you say, I want to give people an opening to say what they think. I know I'm in my second marriage. The second one has lasted significantly more than the first. I haven't felt that either of my wives lacked openings to tell me how they feel. Perhaps they just forced one when I didn't give it.
Yeah, there's open advice given from spouse to spouse all the time. I think that comment really goes into the sort of approach that I have with everybody, whether it's a friend, whether it's a student, whether it's a client. The constant request for feedback is just something that I live by.
Which is fair, and I'm making jokes about it, but I do think that being able to talk openly and honestly to people is essential in any form of relationship. Obviously, I'm trying to laugh about it, but it is probably true that in most relationships, people might nag each other. But I think it's very different for you to say to someone, listen, I would really like to know if I'm doing something that is potentially a problem, that is not helping this thing work as well as it could. And I don't think is very common. At least it's not in the experience I've had with. I think I do that with my wife, but most people I know would be terrified of that type of conversation.
Yeah, I will say for myself, sometimes it's nice to get a sugar-coated piece of feedback. Hey, Brian, that was awesome. But in the end, for me, I like a very symmetric good to bad feedback. Whereas with my employees or with my wife or with my friends, with anyone else, I like to stack the positive praise with a tiny bit of constructive criticism. So for me, I want to push through that. I don't want the fluff. I don't want the nice stuff. I just want the growth stuff. But that's not how it works for everyone. You got to fill that relationship bucket up all the way to the top before you take a scoop out with the constructive praise.
This is something I didn't know about you. I've seen a lot of your stuff on social media, and I've heard your show with the guys plenty of times. And which, by the way, I now realize it's kind of a ripoff of the name of your book. Because the show you do on LinkedIn, what do you guys call it? Lead, Laugh, Love, right? And your book has a pretty special title. Yeah. Do you tell everyone what that book is? Well, it's subtitle, really.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up, because now that show is up on LinkedIn with Jonathan, Ravi, and Alex and Travis, I actually forget the name of my book. I get them confused now. Wait, which one is Learn, Laugh, Love? And wait, what is it? Yeah, see, I get confused now. But the book, let me think. It's Learn, Laugh, Lead. And that was a series of articles and short little pamphlet books that I was writing that was helping people that were new to management. And the title of that first one was called How to Avoid a Huge Leader Shit. And it was just a play on
Which is
leadership
genius.
versus shit. And the story follows this guy called Mr. Butts, who's the guy on the cover.
Okay.
Strangely enough, my public relations guy for that book was also Scott Butts. So he's a lifelong friend of mine, actually. And we got permission from him to use that as our character in the book. But we drew a Mr. Buttface on the cover. And it's supposed to be comical. My friends and even strangers have texted me pictures of reactions of others that have seen them reading the book in public. And it's a good conversation starter for sure.
Well, listen, perhaps this says something about my maturity or lack thereof, but I am not at all above that type of humor. I actually, just today, I posted something on social media about an episode that I put out on the podcast last week about a guy called Mark Ensign, and the book he just published, which I really liked, is called Be a Dick. And, it's not what you think. He's not advocating for people to be horrible human beings, on the contrary. But he said that the play on words and people's reactions to it are a big part of the fun, because, people will react to titles like that. And I think fun is, as I'm sure you strongly agree, is essential to most relationships. And this is I wanted to veer into, I want to talk about story because that's my thing and that's why I typically have people here for. But I want to talk a bit about humor because one of the main approaches you have for leadership is humor, right?
That's correct. Yeah. I am a big believer that playing the fool has helped me significantly grow my career. The reason for that is because I let the barriers break down from the second I appear into any room, from my outfit, from my personality. I'll never forget an administrator at UC Berkeley walking into the room, and they look around confused and they ask one of the students, "Who's the teacher here?"
What were you doing, Brian?
I was just sitting with my feet up on the table in my backwards hat, and I was having a good time. We were laughing and joking in the classroom, and that's exactly what I go for. That's what I think creates the psychological safety in the room for people to open up. When you're overly positive, when you're putting a little silliness and self-enhancing humor into the picture in any conversation, you're allowing more spontaneity and creativity and openness and vulnerability. If people feel safe, they'll let their guard down. And when they let their guard down, they'll contribute their genius. So that's the purpose for me of why humor matters so much.
Have you managed to swing the backwards hat in the business school?
I have. I wore a backwards hat even during my TED Talk. I wear it in every university class that I teach. I wear my hat when I go to client offices and I'm coaching CEOs. And hey, if that doesn't work for them, then we wouldn't be a good fit anyways. So the really point is the authentic self. If you mask who you are, you shall never succeed.
It's not a bone to pick with you, but there's something you advocate very strongly against. And it might just be like, if you're right, then my whole life is wrong. So I need to understand what part of it I'm not understanding correctly. Because when you talk about humor, I believe you say that there are 4 different types of humor. Just like self-enhancing humor, you mentioned that a second ago. There's affiliative humor, which is when people play off each other, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is self-defeating humor and aggressive humor or hostile humor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Right. Now, you, under no uncertain terms, seem to be against, in the articles I've read, against self-deprecating humor, which is what I live by. And I genuinely believe that it serves a very important purpose when it comes to a lot of the things you said, vulnerability and to minimizing the distance between people and saying clearly, not only I'm not better than you, but I'm a flawed human being as well. So you should feel free to be your unique flawed self. Am I wrong? Am I missing something here?
The thing about self-deprecating humor is that it comes at your own expense. Now, if you're able to not turn that into a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you can truly laugh off a self-deprecating joke, go for it. It's really good at reducing power differences and status differentials within the people that you're with. However, most times when people use self-deprecating humor, it becomes a self-defeating thought. And especially if you're at the start of a presentation, at the start of a story, I don't think that's the best leg to stand on. So I always tell people it's usually not okay because it's usually misused. Used effectively, it is a really powerful tool. And there have been US presidents that have been really good at that. There have been some top leaders that's how they relate with people, is through the use of self-deprecating humor. And it's used effectively. It's powerful. The research shows that it's just most people misuse it and it turns into a crutch. So I think especially for women, research in US corporations has been pretty clear around the fact that it's high risk. It can be high reward, but the risk can usually outweigh any of the pros involved.
So I'm interested to figure out what makes it misused or not. So for example, from what you were saying, some of the things I was thinking about is most of the jokes I make to my own expense. Either I don't care about what I'm saying, it's something I'm saying that is perhaps not particularly true. So, I was sharing with you right at the beginning that I had this incident of kidney stones, which is horribly painful. And, the stone has to come out. And the typical way the stone comes out is, as you go to the loo. And then I was talking to some friends of mine. And then I said something like, it looks like it's going to have to come out the usual way. Luckily for me, I'm a modest guy, so it doesn't have a very long distance to travel. Now, I'm not going to go into the merits if that's true or not, but even if it were true, I don't have a problem with that. I'm not carrying a hang-up about that around. So to me, it's just an easy way to make a joke without making it about anyone else. And the same thing when I talk about, how I've made mistakes in my past. I got married when I was 25 and I was divorced when I was 26. Like, those are all true facts, and I have no issue with them that I know of. So, by your definition, is that okay, or could that be potentially be misusing the humor, the self-deprecating humor?
I think the way that you just described that is exactly the powerful way to use it. Put a fun light, a little giggle and a laugh around the things that have been a challenge in the past. Looking back in hindsight it's pretty cool. And we can take that laughter into it. I think the way that you're using it is self-enhancing. So you're using the self-deprecating humor in a positive way. Sadly, some people, they'll make a joke at their own expense, and it will sit there and it will fester in their head as, wait, did I mean that? Did I not mean that? Even the question we talked about earlier on is, what annoys you about me? That's a self-deprecating question, actually. And I'm trying to get the feedback in a lighter way. So instead of saying like, what are the things about me that I need to fix? I say, well, what annoys you about me? That's actually a little bit of self-deprecating humor. I know that some things I do are annoying and I want to change those, but no need to make it a hard and tough discussion. It can be light.
Okay. And the other question I had with humor before we move on to story is, whenever I've done speaking in the past, humor has always been a part of it. And I've done a ton of coaching with people on speaking and help them improve their speeches. But this is something I don't find easy, is, helping people be funnier. I find that, there's some patterns you can teach. There's some things that are fairly straightforward to say, okay, use the rule of 3, exaggerate, and, twist our expectation. But I find that there's a lot from humor is timing, and maybe just a quick wit about it that, if your brain is just not set up that way, it's hard to teach. So what has been your experience with that?
I go back to the goal of humor is just to make people smile. So if you do that using a funny accent or a joke, if you're going to be quick-witted, any of the things that can give you the same result, which is the smile, those are okay. If that comes off in humor, if that comes off on just being really nice, if it comes off on being complimentary, that's all okay. As long as you reach that goal of, hey, they're smiling.
I know I have a funny accent. If you want to tell me, Brian, you can just come out and say it.
Yeah, my favorite one to imitate is like the English and Scottish people, just because it's to me it just sounds funny. It's the same language with such a different tone. Any of my English friends know I like to make fun of them with the accent.
It's great. I'm completely tone deaf for accents. And so I recently had the experience that you've had lots of times, which is teaching at a Latin American MBA. So, I speak Spanish fluently by most people's definition of fluent, but my accent's a bit strange. And I struggle with some conjugations because I don't, strangely enough, living in Spain, I don't speak almost any Spanish. My wife's Brazilian, I'm working English all the time. And so I'll open my lecture on storytelling by saying, there's one question that I need to answer before I do anything else today. Otherwise, this is the only thing you'll be thinking about. And the question is, why is my Spanish so weird? And I eventually blamed it on the Catalans. That, I live in Spain. It's not really Spain, it's Catalonia. They speak many languages and they're not friendly people. So none of this is helping me.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I have to be very aware of that. So I know you've done the story thing with the universities, right? And I want to get to that point because I think that's super interesting. But how did you figure out that story needed to be a big part of your approach? Where did that start for you?
I finished grad school, an MBA, and I would go into my corporate life and I'd have these brilliant ways to improve the business. I was a continuous improvement guy, Lean Six Sigma black belt, all that. I could never get my ideas turned into a plan of action that were approved by executives. And I realized over time that the missing skill was storytelling, communication, captivating people through an influential message. So it doesn't matter. We all have great ideas. We all have expertise in our given craft. But if we cannot communicate those, we are dead in the water. So I went through this process myself of learning everything I could on storytelling, the hundreds of books, the workshops, the webinars, you name it. I had done it for a couple of years. And that turned into my career started changing. I doubled my salary. I started getting new projects. I started getting new responsibility and authority over bigger and better things. And I thought, wow, if they only would have taught me this in business school. So I went and took it upon myself to do some workshops. I started my consulting business. They seemed to be going incredibly well. Companies were calling me back saying, we want to do this again for a bigger audience. And I talked about it in conferences. And eventually that led to teaching a custom developed course at universities. And I've done it maybe 30 times now. When I started actually teaching it, there was a lot of surprises. One of which being when I went down to Peru for the very first time. I think this was January of 2017, maybe. I go down there. I have 50 students. It's an intensive course. So Monday through Friday, they're spending the whole day with me. And by the end of the course, they have to actually go up and present their story, their personal story from birth until what got them in the room today.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Not a story, but the story.
It was intense in so many ways. The laughs, the cries, the hugs, the high fives, the clapping, the applause, the emotions in that room. It was the most energizing feeling I had ever had in my professional life up to that point. And when I came away from that and I came back to the US, I thought, oh my God, that really changed my life. So from there, it just continued. It was like, well, I can't stop there. I got to keep going and keep going. And now one of the things I do in my executive coaching is I teach CEOs how to tell their story. Not only that, but how to have a conversation with their employees and their leadership team about what's their story. And when they're exchanging that story, I do this at executive retreats, one-on-one, or even in corporate training. Once you get to that place where now people are sharing those stories and that's part of the company, this tool, this framework of storytelling, man, it's magic. I don't know how else to put it.
So what approach do you take? And again, if it could be completely different for leaders or for the students, but I've found from experience, there's two very different approaches. So one is sort of structure or theory or framework first, and you're trying to teach people, okay, this is what a story needs to look like. And the other approach is, okay, now let me just get you telling some stories. And once I've gotten you to get them out and to figure out that you can actually do it, now we're going to tailor them to make them look the way they need to look if we want them to be powerful. So what have you inclined more towards?
I have gone the full structure route. So 90% framework and storytelling structure. I prefer Freytag's framework, 5-act, context, problem, climax, falling action, call to action, and then 10% delivery and 0% actually on the content. So it actually it doesn't matter what you say. If you tell it in the right structure and if you deliver the message in an exciting way, do you increase your momentum and volume as you get to the climax and then give people a chance to back down? Do you rise the tension and the cortisol levels as you get up and then let it fall back? Those are the types of things that I teach, not so much what's in the story.
That's super interesting. I'm not sure if I've heard that before, because it's all about testing things and figuring out what works best, right? But for example, the experience I've had recently at an MBA in Barcelona, ESAN, it was super, super hands-on. So these guys, they know what they're doing, right? So the communications course has public speaking and has storytelling for the first-year students, not just the executives, which I was already impressed with. But it's just practice over and over and over, right? So they do something like 10 or 12 different 3-minute speeches or stories in the course of about 2 weeks. And my impression, and I've tried this in other scenarios and seems to be the case, is most people's first attempts at a story are actually pretty close to what a story should be like, but then sometimes they miss some cues that are very important. So the one thing I found a lot is people don't put a moment in there, right? So there is no one particular very vivid moment full of details that the story revolves around. It's more sort of a timeline they're giving you of a whole bunch of events, and then it's just not that. You just don't get absorbed by it. So there's no narrative transportation, or there's no specific details to make you connect with that specific world or environment. But I tended to find that the practice, the heavy on practice approach tends to, at least for the students I've worked with, tended to work better than just giving them frameworks. So I find it interesting that you would say that you wouldn't focus so much, particularly on content. So with leaders, you teach them Freytag's framework, and just run that by again a bit slower, so anyone who hasn't read this 5 times already will catch it.
Yeah, Freytag's framework. So it comes from Gustav Freytag. It's an adaptation of Aristotle's 3-act play, but in a 5-section format. It's pictured as a triangle, and the way that it starts with the context, the who, what, when, where, how, why, what's the purpose, why are we even listening to you to begin with? Then you go into the tension. You're going up the triangle, up the mountain towards the climax. This is the part of the story where you want to increase people's cortisol levels so that by the time they get to hear your climax, they're focused on you. It's a tunnel vision. That's what the cortisol levels are for. Once you get into the climax, it should be kind of short and sweet. This is a major turning point, a major milestone, something that has changed, a spark, an ignition. In a business presentation, this would be the deliverable or the pitch. After the climax, there should be something that indicates that you've just finished the climax. That can be a pause. That can be a shorter volume to indicate that you've just changed sections of your story. I even like to call out, this is the climax of my story. Make it super clear that you've just reached the tip of the mountain. You're at that mountaintop moment. Then you're going to back them down into the falling action. You got to calm people back down. You don't want them in this heightened state for the whole time. So send the elevator back to ground floor. Tell them why it matters. Sprinkle in some achievements, things that have happened since then. This is the supporting evidence. Or in a business presentation, this would be the data. And then at the bottom is the call to action. This is the way that business stories and personal stories are different. Whereas in personal stories or movies, you don't want to walk away with an instruction or guidance. But in business, you want there to be some request at the end. And the clearer the call to action, the clearer people know what to do with what you just said. So that's the general structure there, the 5 points up and down the triangle.
And by your mention of cortisol, I take it that you're familiar with Paul Zach's work, right?
Yeah. Paul Zach. Claremont University. I spoke to him. He's a great guy.
Oh yeah, well, I haven't spoken to him personally, but yeah, his work. I'm not sure here, but I think that most of what people talk about nowadays is storytelling about how it induces oxytocin, which is the trust hormone, and dopamine for attention, and endorphins. I think most of that comes from his work, right?
It does. Yeah, he studied the release of oxytocin in people's blood through different human interactions, from weddings to storytelling to everyday communications. The thing about trust, this oxytocin hormone, the bonding molecule, this is something that's released during handshakes, human touch, sex, childbirth, hugs, high fives. The way that you can induce oxytocin during a story is by getting overly open. So trust is a reciprocal emotion. If I give you my trust, So if I'm open and I tell you my real story, the deeper, darker stuff, then you're going to want to reciprocate that at a biological level, at the oxytocin level, at the hormonal level. You're going to want to give me that back in return. So as you're talking about that rising action and the building of tension up through the story as you approach the climax, that's the oxytocin moment. That's where you're going to open up and actually tell, how did that problem make you feel? So in my class, people have talked about some really hard stuff, and they talked about how it made them feel. And by the time they got to the climax of their story, we're all now flooded with oxytocin. And we're now feeling like when it's our turn to tell our story, we might go that extra mile because they just did, and they've opened up that gate for us of vulnerability and openness.
So this leads me to something I wanted to ask you about, because you're describing people talking about really, really painful moments or really vulnerable moments in their lives. And I've heard you tell of your personal story that involved quite a lot of hardship because you had lots of, was it a car accident or healthy? I know that there were health issues, but I remember if there was a car accident in there as well.
It was a rare bone disease in my spine.
Okay. And you had like loads of surgery or something horrible like that, right?
Yep.
But actually, I need to bracket that. I heard you describe that after you were going through that, you developed, I think you called it like a fear of death. And I went and tried to find a technical name for it. And I think I stumbled upon the same thing you did. So it's thanatophobia is the right name. But if you look it up, you end up finding thanotic phobia, which is the fear of Thanos, as the fear of the Marvel supervillain Thanos, which can lead to snapophobia, which is the fear of snapping.
That's funny. Yeah, the fear of snapping. Oh yeah, because he does the snap and then everybody on the world
snap thing. Yes. Yeah. It's the irrational fear of Thanos snapping his fingers and sending half of the universe away. But anyway, right. So I've seen you describe that story, and it's a gut-wrenching story. But my question to that is, yes, 100%, I can see how that story would lead to trust. So someone hears that story, now I feel I can tell you just about anything. But how do you feel about stories like that being used in an environment where, I'm not saying it's not that you're not trying to generate trust. Obviously, you need trust for business. But, most scenarios where you could use storytelling for business, that type of story might perhaps not be the type of story that you would tell. You would use different types of storytelling. So I just wanted you to get your take on when that type of story would be appropriate in business and when it might not be.
So the personal story would be very powerful for personal introductions. If you want to jumpstart from surface level nonsense with an acquaintance to an actual relationship, the personal story model is very effective. Now in business though, if I'm trying to get a project approved, and I'm going through that tension, I can't be talking about my spine surgeries. That's ridiculous. But you could talk about, if we don't automate this process, here's what will continue to happen for the employees. Here's how they feel doing this stuff manually. Here's how they feel with the fact that they're not given the resources that they need to succeed. So you can always find some level of tension. It might take some searching, but it's always there. I mean, there's no limit of hardship in the workplace for any given problem. And hey, if there is no problem, if there isn't something that is deep enough to actually address that, then you're not telling the right story. You gotta figure out what is the right story here.
Yeah, because the reason I asked that is because something I've come across often is, and this happens a lot with professional speakers. So for a long time, there was this type of professional speaker that was very much in demand, the climbed Everest, survived cancer professional speaker. And that fell out of fell out of popularity after a while, not because those stories weren't inspiring, but I think it's because the novelty had worn off and people struggled to connect to those stories. I am now going through my own medical mishaps, which are nowhere near as serious as yours, but it's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to hear someone going through something incredibly painful that took years to overcome and relate to that. I mean, you definitely feel that this person is being open and vulnerable with you, but I don't think you necessarily hear that and go, oh, you're just like me. That's what I found a lot with people. Get this idea that if you have this super difficult or heroic personal story, that's the story that needs to be told. And sometimes it's not. That won't always bring you closer to people. I think sometimes it might actually make it harder for them to feel close to you because they can't relate.
Yeah. So there's so many good points there. Within this sort of hero of, oh, I climbed Mount Everest, or I got through 5 surgeries, or whatever the thing is. It's the little stuff that people relate to. So within my story, my personal story, there would be sprinkles in of other stuff. How I dropped out of college to take care of my sick aunt who had a brain aneurysm. Well, if you've taken care of a family member, you could relate to what that felt like. So those tiny pieces are the thing that you want to get people to relate to. If you're telling the story and the problem is too dramatic, and you're now a pointy triangle, and you're way too over the top, and it's all climax, or it's all tension, you've failed. And people think, I mean, people aren't stupid. They can't be manipulated. If you're not telling the right story at the right time, they're going to just look at you like, what the hell is this thing? So I think it just comes back to the little things, the little sort of implicit, relatable trust elements within your story. Like when you were telling me earlier about, it was before we recorded, but about kidney stones. And I returned with, my brother told me about how paralyzing it was for him when he was driving, had to stop his car and all this. That's relation. I can relate to you, even though I haven't personally had that yet. I probably will at some point, but
I'm sorry already.
I wouldn't wish that upon my greatest enemy, right? But those things we want to latch on to people in their stories. And if you don't give them any details, if you give them nothing about the emotional element, then it's hard to get anything to relate.
It just doesn't feel real. It's this paradox of storytelling, which is the specific makes it universal. Otherwise, it just feels generic. Oh, yeah, no, I have this thing and I'm not feeling, yeah, but give me the specifics. And then I think we'll be thinking, okay, do I know anyone who suffered that? No, but I know someone who suffered something that kind of sounds similar. But, the pain sounds similar, the health issue is different, but you'll be looking for connections there somewhere. But if it's generic and if it's not specific, then you won't be able to make those connections. You won't have enough to latch on to, as you said.
Yeah. We want to see extraordinary people, but we want to see that they're ordinary first. The other thing I think is cool about storytelling is letting it be organic. So if I was looking at notes right now, I'd be giving myself a massive crutch. And this is what I hated about the TEDx talk experience, was that you have to send your speech to them in advance. So it's written all the way, full script. Number one is it's really difficult to memorize a 15-minute speech or less. Even if it was 5 minutes, that's difficult. 2 minutes is difficult. 20 seconds is difficult. So that part in itself is an additional challenge. The second part is, if I'm telling a story that I wrote out completely, I've just lost all spontaneity, all organic nature of that, and a lot of the emotion that comes up naturally as I'm telling this story, because then I'm just practicing it to perfect it, not to connect. So you've lost that. So I encourage people, anyone who tells a story, just outline it. Give yourself some freedom and autonomy within those story spaces to do what you got to do.
Yeah, I've heard many people complain about the difficulty of memorizing speeches. Now, my brain just works in a perhaps slightly different way, that I've always found that up to about 15, 20 minutes, I can memorize word for word. But you're absolutely right. It's very, very difficult to do that and not sound... You have to rehearse so much not to sound rehearsed that it's beyond most people. So, with story, what I found now that, I'm putting the stories on social media and things of that nature, is I never write them anymore. I just say, okay, it's this and then that other thing. And then I turn the clock on and I just tell it. Okay, but that was just too long. And then I tell it again, and then I tell it again. And then at some point I was like, okay, but that's about it. It's never going to be word perfect, but it's still going to end up probably being, 80% of the same words every time. But if it changes, I haven't gone off track. I've just said it in a slightly different way. And then it still sounds like a person telling a story, although one that you can tell well, and not either something completely memorized, which would be awful, or this rambling thing that doesn't go anywhere and has all sorts of distractions in the middle, which I think is how a lot of people tell stories, right? I'm not one of those people that believe that like every single person is a good storyteller, because I have friends and my friends suck. So yeah, there's that as well. Okay, so let me just go back to something you said before, because you said that at least the way you teach storytelling seems to be mostly focused on the structure and a bit of the delivery, not so much on the content. But when you are teaching leaders how to tell stories, are you focusing on, okay, let's figure out the stories and work on them together and you're done? Or, you should be able to do this by yourself with different stories. And then you tell them what types of stories they should be looking for. So that's what I'm not clear. Like if you don't work on content, at least you need to probably work on where you find the content, right?
Yeah. So the content piece, usually if you're good with the structure, really good with the structure. I actually, when people ask me questions, I imagine a little TEDx framework in the corner of my mind there, and I just kind of fill it in. So if I'm asked a question that's an impromptu story about XYZ, I've got something to rely on that gives me a little bit of structure and confidence. I mold it around like putty to make it what it needs to be at that moment, but I can use it as, hey, I'm going to rely on that when I need it. In the storytelling class that I teach at universities, and not so much in the corporate, but at universities, because we have so much more time together, they'll do impromptu speeches. I'll give them 60 seconds, a random topic. If you were president tomorrow, what would you do? And they just have to speak about it for 60 seconds. At minimum, this is a Toastmasters exercise. They have to go up in front of the room.
Yes, the famous table topics.
Topics, yep. And they have to just talk about it for 60 seconds minimum. And once they get that 60 seconds, you lower the timer, and then they can finish their sentence and walk off, or they can keep going. But minimum 60 seconds. By doing that over and over, you start to get into the groove. Like, okay, I understand how to apply this to strange questions about aliens or cars or whatever. The CEOs, when I'm asking them to tell their stories, it's really just to connect with people on the emotional level, build relational trust. Usually, because my focus is high trust leadership, when I'm going into an organization, they've called me because someone or a consultant or someone in the organization has identified that trust is an issue there. So I just focus on the base trust of personal story type trust. When I go in and work with sales teams and marketing teams, then we start talking about business stories and how to craft your message, your client problem, your deliverable, your pitch, how to get them away from the thing that's hurting them. That kind of stuff is I think more about content and less about the
yeah, I get you. I think, again, there's people name stories in all sorts of different ways, but there's a story that you tell to basically tell people I'm like you, or I'm a bit like you, right? You're bringing me in to talk, I'm going to be a new manager in an engineering company. I need to tell you that I kind of understand engineering issues to a tiny degree. Otherwise, I'm just the alien arriving here. So, and that's one type of story, and that is a story to build trust and to foster openness. It is very different if you're trying to sell something, and then you're trying to find a story that shows the other customer that has gone through that and benefited from that. In that aspect, I get that. I just find interesting how there's so many different approaches to this, and I'm also curious if your approach meets less resistance when it comes to people moaning the way they always moan, how they don't have any stories. And then you have to coax it out of them until they realize, oh, are those stories? Yes, man. Things that happen to you are stories. You just haven't told them yet. So do you find that when you do the approach you use, do you get that type of pushback of not knowing what to talk about or not having the stories?
Yeah. And I have to ask 100 questions just to get through the context at times. What I did find, though, is once you push people to actually get that out, there's this really sort of deep cathartic release that happens. It's like, damn, I got through that. Now I can actually picture myself as a storyteller in some way. Like, I did it once. I could do this again. And the personal story is not an easy one to tell sometimes. I think there's this quote Brene Brown says, something like, everyone has a story that can bring you to your knees. But that's only if you actually tell the story and actually develop your story. So you've got to get to this place where you're not a blank, faceless, in the shadows presence. Telling your story can change someone's life. Telling your story can give you confidence. Telling your story can get you a promotion. Telling your story can give you more trust in the workplace. There's so many benefits. So it's a disservice not to share your story. And that's some of the convincing that I have to do with people is like, okay, walk me through this. Well, no, not just like where you grew up, but how did it feel when you were a child? What did you do? What were you good at? What did you like? What friends did you have? How many siblings did you have? How did you interact with your siblings? So you have to push deep and hard to get that stuff out of them sometimes. But then they tell their story and they're like, oh, yeah, I did it.
Yeah, it's that challenge of trying to convince people that they need to show you stuff and not tell you, right? And says, okay, fine. So you had a terrible experience with your boss or with your father or whatever. Now, don't tell me how it was for years. Tell me how it was once at Thanksgiving. So what did that Thanksgiving look like in this horrible family environment you grew up in? Just tell me that one thing with as much detail as you can, and now I can picture everything else. Like, I don't need you to tell me how it went on for 10 years. Just say, and it was always like that. After you've given me this super vivid picture of real life, because again, family being an easy example that we all have, occasional challenges with, but I think that is true for most stories. And just a final one. How different do you find doing the story work with Americans and with Latin Americans?
Oh my gosh, there's so many differences. So number one is Americans are a lot easier to boast about their accomplishments and achievements.
which make for the best stories, clearly.
And I mean, that's a gross generalization, but actually I found it to be true in teaching that in the US and Latin America. There's something about the stories that I hear in Peru specifically where it's never a story about one person. There's somehow always this element of service, element of family, element of connection and bonding. And also, one thing I found is in some countries, they've actually been through a lot more. Like, even though the reason that I bring up my health issues is because actually I had a great childhood. I grew up in a pretty wealthy family in a big house, and the three brothers, all we did was play and hang out and be competitive together. So I can't really relate to like a struggling childhood. It's just the cards I was dealt. But in some countries, that's not the case. They'll have fought tooth and nail to get through high school. Where for me, graduating high school is like everyone in my city graduated high school. There wasn't a single dropout. And 95% of the people went straight off to an Ivy League school. There's just so many more differences. I think always back to my mother and father-in-law. They grew up in Peru, actually. And when my wife was 3 years old, they had to come to the US because in Peru, there was all sorts of things, from economic collapse to the deflation to political issues, even some terrorism. And having to go through that at that age, they were like, let's say, I think they were in their early 30s when my wife was 3. I'm 36. I'm turning 37 this month. I haven't been through anything like that. That's so gnarly. And what's even crazier is they actually came to the US with Christina, my wife, and then they couldn't afford to stay. So they had to go back and forth for a few years. Like, how could they have gotten through that? That's a new level of adventure and challenge that I've never faced. And I found that in some countries, there's more systemic issues that are pushing people through external challenges that they got through. And it's amazing.
There is that expression that has become a bit of a joke nowadays, which is, first world problems, or, white people's problems. But it's 100% true. I'm from Brazil, but I'm from, a reasonably wealthy part of Brazil, and my family was middle class. We didn't have a lot of money, but I still went to like a very good school because I got like a scholarship or something. And my friends were all, by most people's standards, they were pretty rich. And then you compare that to the lives of other people that I met in the same city, and it was just universes apart. So I used to play capoeira, and most of the people that played capoeira were pretty simple people from like more humble backgrounds. And the type of stuff they told me about, the problems they had, to me just sounded like movie stuff, right? It's just nothing. I could not relate to almost any of that in my experience. And I think that it might be one of the reasons why I think that Latin Americans have gotten particularly good at finding the stuff to laugh about in life. Because if you don't develop that skill, you're screwed. There's so many problems that you have to cope with on a day-to-day basis, from terrible politicians and from crime and sometimes hunger and worse things than that if you don't learn how to laugh about life in general and find joy in simple things, and if it's all just the big achievements, it's pretty hard to to grow up to be the open and friendly people that I think a lot of Latin Americans end up being. So I'm sure there's plenty of lessons there if anyone wants to pay attention to that.
Yeah, I agree with you completely.
All right, Brian. So if people want a bit more of your stuff, now I'll link up to the book on the show notes. But where should they go to find your work on leadership or the humor stuff or the storytelling?
If you care about people, leadership, trust, humor, I'll be on LinkedIn. I post almost every day with either a video or a PDF document that you can download. I like to give as much of the learnings that I've had just a way for people to try to benefit from and that they can use immediately. So I'll be on LinkedIn, Brian Harman. That's where you can find me.
And your show with the name that will forever confuse you about your own book, Lead, Laugh, Love. You guys are putting that out every Monday, right?
Yeah, we're on break right now. We're setting up for season 2.
Season 2. I think all you need to do to maintain and grow your audience is release either the bloopers or your singing. I think you inflicted your tech song on most of us and had like that bloody awful thing in our heads for weeks. So more of that. I would say don't ever do that again, but also more of that.
Yeah, I've got. So they've made some blooper reels, and they put me on my knees. They're so funny because the guys, speaking of hostile humor, we just beat each other down. Like stuff you shouldn't say to people. So we'll post some more bloopers for sure.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, mate. I managed to get this through without having to reach out for the hard drugs. I'll put that credit to you, and I'm sure we'll catch each other on LinkedIn one of these days.
Yeah, thank you, Francisco. My pleasure.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a review or a rating on the Apple Podcasts app. It's very easy. You open the app and find this show. Then scroll down a little, and when you see the stars, tap. I'd really appreciate it, and it does help other people find us. And if you'd like to get in touch or find out more about what I do, reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit my website, storypowers.com.